Hi everyone, Coach Heather here at King Cardin Fit Body Bootcamp. It is Tuesday, but yesterday was New Year's Day and we weren't open. So we're doing nutrition news today. Today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition in general and why it can be very confusing to people. This time of year, a lot of people are making resolutions, either getting more involved in fitness or just getting involved in fitness, including getting to the gym, working out, and looking at their dietary needs and what their diet is in general. So starting to do a little bit more research, looking into things, and it can be confusing. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those reasons of why it is so confusing. First one being is that the research in terms of nutrition is still relatively young. If you think we're looking at like 1200 BC when they first discovered metals and that they can be manipulated. Then you look at the fact that, it was about 150 years ago that they first treated scurvy. So in the big picture, nutritional research is still very, very young. Just in the 1970s is when we first found the link between coronary heart disease death and low HDL cholesterol levels. So just in general, the research in terms of nutrition is still very young. So we don't have a lot of results. We don't have a lot of research yet. And you can imagine, like with everything, it is limitless. So things will always be changing, always be finding new things. So still very young in general. The other reason why nutrition information can be very confusing is that the funding in terms of research and nutrition is more treatment rather than proactive or preventative. So if you look at billions of dollars roughly spent, we're looking at about $500 million spent on getting optimal nutrition into our bodies. If we compare that to diabetes, digestive diseases, kidney diseases, heart, lung, blood diseases, and also cancer. Billions of dollars spent on those, way higher. So just in general, the research is based more on treatment rather than preventative, which is where good nutrition typically comes into play. So not only is the research very young, but we don't have the funding for the nutrition part of it that we do for the treatment part of it. The other thing too in terms of research is that we have to look at how the research has been funded, and that may play a part in what the findings are. So if you look, maybe the question is, can sugary drinks lead to weight gain? If the study itself has been funded by a party that has a financial conflict of interest, then those results may be a little different from a study that's been funded with no financial gain or no financial interest in it. So that's not to say that researchers are cheating. It just may influence some of the variables that they're using or some of the measurements that they're taking, because there can be corporate pressures that come into play, or the design of the study itself can be affected because those companies want to have something that they can use in terms of promotion and marketing. So the research itself, we have to make sure that it is unbiased. So one way to do that is to check where it's funded. That may not always be the case. That could lead to a bias in the research, but it's always definitely something good to check out. Another reason why nutrition itself is so tricky and can be confusing is that the variables themselves can be very hard to prove in terms of the effect of nutrition. So by that, your general health, your age, the climate, your income can play a factor. Epigenetics, your ethnicity, your heritage, your mental health. Do you smoke? Do you not smoke? Do you have any other addictions? How is your sleeping? How are your hormones? Lots of different variables that are going to come into play with each of our study subjects. And because it is nutrition, we need our bodies to do that research, to get that data. So when we have so many different variables involved, obviously there are going to be different results come into play. And that's why some findings can be so drastic in terms of the difference in what they have to report, because there just are so many different variables out there. So again, food preferences, even gender, all of these things are going to play a part in the effects of different studies. So keeping that in mind as well, just because you read something or hear something, it may be completely opposite for you and your body, just depending on all those variables. The other thing too, when we have nutritional studies, they tend to be observational. So when we look at these things, questionnaires usually, or just questions that we're asking people, so the research that we get typically from nutritional studies is just based on observation, those findings. So why is this important to keep in mind? People can be terrible at remembering what they ate or how much they ate. So if they're asked to report certain things and they're forgetting these things, that's obviously going to affect the results from that. So maybe they forget exactly what they had for breakfast, or they forget that they had a snack here or there, and they forget to report it. So obviously those findings are going to be a little screwed up or misconstrued. There's also a lot of weird correlations or weird findings that get reported. And then you have to look at correlation versus causation. So for example, does red meat cause heart disease and cancer? Or do people with these chronic diseases just happen to eat more red meat? So does one necessarily cause the other? Or is it vice versa? Is it just a coincidence? So is there a correlation, or is it causation? So lots of different things to think about when we're taking in information, when we're listening to shows on TV, when we're reading newspaper articles or magazine articles. Lots of different things to consider, and that's why we always try and take things with a grain of salt. The other thing that can cause nutrition findings to be misleading or confusing is that measurement tools, they have limitations. They're not always going to be 100%. So some of the things that we can look at, nutrition labels, so they can be off by up to 50%. Those calorie counts, measurements, just because it's on that specific food label does not mean that it's 100%. So there can be differences up to 50%. The other thing too is that we digest food. We don't absorb all of the energy that we intake. That's just a fact. So we can't go by X amount of calories consumed, X amount of protein, carbohydrates. We're not going to actually absorb all of it. And because there's no standard for how much energy we absorb, everybody's unique, so there is no standard. So you have to keep that in mind as well, is that we don't know exactly how much of the energy we are actually absorbing. Another thing that can be confusing is when you're on a treadmill, when you've got your Fitbit on, your heart rate monitor, things like that. Calorie burns, their estimates can be off from anywhere to 3 to 45%, depending on that measuring tool. So I have a heart rate monitor. I was on the treadmill yesterday, went for a lovely run. My treadmill gave me a calorie burn. My polar heart rate monitor gave me a calorie burn. And they were 185 calories off. So again, we have to take things with a grain of salt. It's good to have a ballpark, but unless we invest in some really high-tech gizmos, just be prepared for some variance and some measurements being a little off. The other thing too to consider is that your history of diet and body composition is also going to influence how much energy you use as a person. So that caloric intake, the calories that you're burning, and they are going to be affected by your body composition and your dieting. So another reason, another way that what we read, what we hear may not come into play exactly how we've understood it. Another way that nutrition and nutrition information can be confusing is that it doesn't always affect our health right away. You see the cute little pictures and the cute little memes. I did some crunches and people lift up their shirt and they want to see where their abs are. Same idea, same concept. We can make these positive changes. We can kick bad habits to the curb, everything like that. But we have to give it time. We have to be patient. We have to be consistent and diligent and all that good stuff because they don't affect right away. So we talked a little bit about, does red meat cause cancer? If we were to actually do a study to try and get results, we'd have to put people basically in a bubble for about 30 years. Seal them off in the metabolic chambers, eating various amounts of red meat for about 30 years. And who's going to want to sign up for that? So again, we have to be realistic in how we're measuring things, how we're testing things, and then when we read those findings, again, take it with a grain of salt, knowing that a lot of different things can come into play. Another reason why things can be a little bit confusing when we start doing more research into nutrition is that sometimes we assume that every finding applies to us. We talked a little bit about those different factors, your age, your health, your gender, your illness level. Maybe you're fighting a cold right now. So maybe you're in the gym and your heart rate's going to be a little bit more elevated than the person working next to you. It just depends. A lot of different factors can come into play. They may have published some findings and just the results and not talked about the study group that they used. So I am a female who's now in my 40s. So if they've done a study with 20-year-old males and I expect the same thing, the same results from this nutrition program that's been promised, I'm not going to see them because I am older. I am a female opposed to a male. So there are lots of different things. Also, some research is done on animals, right? Not even human. So keep that in mind as well. And then when they talk about averages, they are bell curved, right? So they're just taking the averages depending on what they're reporting. So keep in mind that you might be on either end of the spectrum as well. So lots of different things to consider. And the final thing that I wanted to touch base with, we talk about negatives and why things are so confusing. And they truly are, which is why, you want to read everything you can, talk to as many people as you can, be patient, be calm, decide what's going to work with you, and you may need to tinker with things. You may need to try a few different things. But the other thing we need to keep in mind too is that reporters are not scientists. So they could read some studies, they could do the research, but they may not have the understanding that the scientists do. So maybe they misunderstood the study's conclusions. Maybe they're over-exaggerating a single study finding because they don't understand how a single study can fit into the bigger picture in terms of nutrition. It is what it is. Reporters, they make their money selling stories. So if they can take something and exaggerate it, and it's going to sell, then that might happen. Doesn't mean they're bad people. They're just making a living too. Sometimes this brings to light information that we didn't know previously, or information that might contradict or help to explain something else. But it is confusing. It really is. There is a wealth of knowledge out there. Not always 100%. But nothing really is. And things are always changing. I remember, I think it was on Oprah, and, 1 month tomatoes cause cancer and nobody was eating tomatoes. And then a few months down the road, everybody was eating tomatoes again. Same thing happened with red meat. So yes, it is a very confusing world out there. We do our best. And that is why, if you have questions, we want to consult people. Ask any questions that you have and reach out, see what you can. So don't stop researching, guys. Don't stop reading. Don't stop watching different, Dr. Oz shows or anything like that. If it's interesting to you, then definitely do the research. Find out what you can, but just keep in mind that there are a number of different factors that are going to make things confusing. Take things with a grain of salt and just have fun with it. All right? Take care, guys, and I will see you next week. All right? Bye-bye.